Right, we're starting, and I managed to mess up the timeline very early in the day, but anyway, that's set the scene. But that was too good to leave, wasn't it, in there with Dr. Fox. So, I'd like to introduce Dr. Terence Carron, who's a bit of a lifesaver. In many ways, he's become engaged with UCM.
I haven't done my presentation yet, I wouldn't say that.
All right, then, yeah. He may be a lifesaver. But he's engaged with UCM over the last couple of months, and we're keen to continue that conversation. And Terence, you would have come over for the event anyway, but quite late, as I said, in there during the week. One of our spots became available. And you do have a strong Manx connections? With a name like Karen?
I was born here, my sister's traced back our ancestry to 1440.
Okay, so probably stronger Manx than quite a few of us, some people might be in the room there. A Professor of Higher Education Policy in the University of Lincoln Centre for Education Research and Development. From 2005 to 7 was a visiting professor at the Autonomous University of Guadalajara.
Mexico's second largest city.
That's it, that's the next thing I was saying. Where you work for the World Bank Institute of Global Development Learning Network for Latin America and the Caribbean. You're currently emeritus professor at the University of Lincoln. Really, Terence has done an awful lot of research, a lot of publication, and done a lot of really interesting things, but your current major research interest is academic freedom, which is where you're at the moment. But you are interested, and this is where this presentation comes from, interested and proficient in e-learning as well, and hence today's presentation. From bricks to clicks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Terence.
Thank you for that introduction. I should go in a bit more detail in terms of the context. So, I started up as a normal university lecturer, and I started to provide handouts for students. I was teaching public policy at that time. And I found that students would turn up at the seminar saying that they lost the sheet for the week, so they couldn't participate in the seminar. So I got a bit annoyed with this, so I then produced a book. I handed it to students at the beginning of the term, but then they lost the book. And what I then did is I got some very basic IT program called Toolbook, and I put the lecture book up on Toolbook so they could never ever lose it. And the lecture notes included information relating to all the lectures, but also indicative reading and seminars and everything else. So I became a bit of an expert on the use of new technologies in teaching and learning, for which reason I was asked to go to Guadalajara to do work for the university. It's the oldest autonomous university in Mexico, and also to work with the World Bank Institute. It has a global learning network for Latin America and the Caribbean. So unusually, although I was not Mexican, I was the Mexican representative within the GDMA. I went to large parts of Mexico delivering information. And what we did is we developed open distance learning. This was then sent up to the World Bank Institute in Washington. They then piped it down across all the Latin American states. And in each one of the Latin American countries, there was a GDLN centre. And people would come from the area around the GDLN centre to actually attend the lecture online. And then we'd have a joint discussion online using new technologies. Now, I'll briefly say something about academic freedom, and that is that this was at the time when every university was going to become a virtual university, and it was the time of the dot-com boom. And I found there were large numbers of American universities seeking to establish study centres in Latin American states and undermine the existing university in terms of cost. And what was interesting was that the academics, for example, from New York University, they enjoyed academic freedom up in the United States, but the people in Mexico, they hired by the hour. They had no academic freedom at all. And that's what moved me away from looking at using new technology towards looking at academic freedom. So what I'm about to show you here really is the combination of work I undertook in Latin America, but also I did work in Finland. For example, I wrote a monograph on creating a virtual university in Finland. The Finnish government then paid for me to come to Finland and give seminars in 8 or 9 universities in Finland, and they built a virtual university there. Given the size of the audience, which I'm sure reflects my personal charisma, I'll be very happy for you to interrupt as we go along. Now, the first slide that I'm going to give you is not relevant to the topic, but it is relevant to pretty much every presentation you've ever seen. So here we see the devil who's interviewing a demon for a job and said, I need someone well versed in the art of torture. Do you know PowerPoint? There is a problem in that what I'm about to tell you does not lend itself very readily to incredible diagrams or pictures or whatever. I do apologise for that. And I've got to cover a larger amount of ground during this period of time, but I can say, if you're tempted, and I see you have a notepad, if you're tempted to take notes, please don't. I will give the slides to Gary, who will make them universally available. Okay? So, I'm going to be covering 5 different topics. Firstly, looking at some terms, because there's not much agreement about what e-learning is. Secondly, looking at changes in higher education teaching and learning. Then global developments in technology and learning. Then what the lessons we learned from this. And then finally, coming up to date, looking at the impact of COVID and also the impact of AI on teaching and learning in higher education. So, distance education. What is distance education? Well, as I put here, 3 defining features. The student is distanced from the teacher, the student has a planned and guided learning experience, and they participate in a 2-way structured discourse. So the separation between the teacher and the student requires that the teachers plan and present contact and interact within the learning process. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever done an OU course, but OU courses typically take between 2 and 4 years to actually build. My brother-in-law actually worked at the OU Milton Keynes. Because everything has to be planned. All the material has to be put together. It all has to link together sequentially. So students are told what the learning outcomes will be. They're then told they have to achieve these learning outcomes. They're then given materials which enable them to do that. And that then fills the gap between the knowledge they have when they arrive and the knowledge they have when they leave. So it's quite an involved process. What I've done here is try to cut through some of the problems with respect to definitions. So we have distance education, which I mentioned. Distance learning is not that much different. Distributed learning is about a learning environment where there's a dispersed student population. And interestingly enough, Finland is the 12th largest country in Europe, but it also has only 5 million people. So they became experts in distributed learning because the Finnish constitution indicates that everyone should have the same educational chances. E-learning is a subset of distributed learning, and as we shall see, it relies on digital content, but it also is network enabled, and collaboration is a key part of e-learning in higher education. Network learning is similar insofar as learners and instructors use computers to exchange information and dialogues and collaborate. And finally, open learning. Most of the open universities in Europe, the FERN, for example, in Germany, and also the UK, and UNED in Spain, have some kind of open learning so far as there's self-instruction, you complete courses, structured, specially prepared materials. So, there is a problem with e-learning, and I've tried to encapsulate on this slide. And that is, it is used so broadly, this definition, that it really ceases to mean anything. And it can be very, very well explained, but not well explained. And what this means is, some people will claim huge benefits for it, and other people would even look at the same research and say, no, these benefits don't exist. So what you should try and do is think about exactly what e-learning is. And what then happened was that the European Union got Professor Robin Mason from the OU to actually look at e-learning and try to define it. And Robin came up with 3 distinct ideas with respect to e-learning. The first one relates to work-based training. In other words, e-learning is allowed and enabled to actually transfer information and deliver it cheaply. So the main emphasis here is on the electronic nature of delivery of the content and not the communication potential of it. So as a result, people who want this aspect of e-learning, they often have a behaviourist conception of learning. They focus on the development of presented content, facilities for testing, etc., etc. Access to training is very important and brings reduced costs and better speed with respect to the way it's delivered. So these are the main attractions of this form of e-learning. In other words, you deliver the content very, very cheaply to a very large number of people at a distance. The second idea of e-learning that Robin came up with is that within HE, e-learning means electronic access and interaction by students. In other words, the main attraction they have in e-learning here is the fact that students can communicate with each other and also with the tutor, both synchronously and asynchronously across a wide area. So, in this instance, the communication potential and not just delivery of content is important. And that then is reflected in the way in which practitioners of this type of e-learning actually operate. So they normally have a constructivist paradigm of learning. They're trying to transform the role of both the instructor and also the pupil. So the role of the instructor, and I'll come on to this, becomes that of a facilitator of knowledge construction, rather than the sage on the stage, which is another phrase I'll use later. The idea here is we should create a social environment where students can learn online, both from the tutor and, crucially, and also from each other. It's a mode of collaborative learning. The third definition that Robin came up with is the idea of e-learning, and this is, I think, contentious, e-learning to enable informal learning, in other words, learning by doing, actually in the workplace. So in this respect, learning is related to job performance. It may not be formally organised or even assessed in a particular programme, but it accounts for a good deal of learning arising out of interactions between colleagues and students in their personal studies. Again, this is different from the other two. So, when we're looking at this type of e-learning, there are, the technologies of relevance are into two groups. First, information retrieval. Secondly, knowledge construction. Information retrieval covers all forms of search and retrieval software, databases, data mining, etc., etc. Knowledge construction covers all forms of communications, from simple email, often through a virtual whiteboard, towards much more detailed feedback. I don't know if you used here Polev? No? Okay, so it's an online piece of software and you set it up and you tell your students to log in themselves online and they can then give their opinions of the lecture as you're going along. And you can see it in real time. And it can be quite disconcerting, I'm saying this. But it is very good for getting immediate feedback.
Would
So
that
you know.
be anonymous?
Sorry?
Would that be anonymous?
Yes, yeah. It comes up as student 1, student 2, student 3. And it's free, it doesn't cost anything. So what I've tried to do here is to look at these different learning forms of Mason's typology and structure them so you can see the different features of them. So here we have web-based training, where the emphasis is on delivery of content cheaply, they are delivery driven. Supported online learning, which is very much akin to blended learning in HE. Learner focused rather than content focused, activity driven, small group learning, significant interaction. And then over here, informal e-learning, group focused, practice driven, organisational learning. So they're quite different, one with the other. And if you're looking at as to whether e-learning is working well, effectively, efficiently, you have to work out exactly what your definition of e-learning is before you can do that. So, the use of new technologies in teaching and learning has occurred across universities across the globe. So they're quite commonplace, I was suggesting, but they've also prompted a very big debate about as to whether it's the E or the learning that's important. There are some who say you can do learning as effectively on the web as you can face-to-face. There are others who say no, you cannot. Each teaching event is a unique event, you can't do it. And this is ongoing, but it has now got additional significance with the rise of, among other things, AI, which I'll come to now. So, we all know universities, even traditional ones like Oxford and Cambridge, they're now saying they offer blended learning. So, this approach uses multiple media. In other words, books, but it could also be a slideshow, it could also be a film on the net or whatever. You're looking at getting information from a variety of different media to offer a learning content in various formats. Having said that, in order to be successful, the blend of learning technologies needs to relate to the subject content and the students' learning styles and their needs. Unfortunately, these will vary from individual to individual. And that raises the issue as to whether you can put together a blending learning package which will appeal to every type of student with their own different type of learning style. It may be very difficult to do. There may, in other words, not be a common denominator with respect to the content. We now move on to the second part of the talk, tendencies, what changes have taken place in HE teaching and learning. So what I've tried to do here is to think about the different shifts in a variety of different measures with respect to higher education and the way in which new technologies have altered it. So under the old paradigm for HE, students had to take what was on offer. Nowadays we're moving towards the idea of courses on demand, very, very quickly and easily put together. We used to have an academic calendar. We all know that people used to suggest that academics in the summer do absolutely nothing. Okay. Nowadays, well, at least within my time at university, we had to tell people what we were doing over the summer period, and we were given n number of weeks as a holiday. For the rest of the time, we had to be available. The idea of university from an institution, in other words, the bricks themselves, the idea of a university as an idea, virtually in space, providing teaching and learning for a vast array of different learners' needs. The shift from having a first degree, which obviously is important, but as more people get a first degree, in order to make a difference in the job market, you now have to have a master's. So there's a shift away from just one event to get a degree towards the idea of having lifelong learning. In other words, having to reskill oneself as one goes through one's working life to remain in employment. Universities in the past were considered to be ivory towers, not anymore. Nowadays we have places like Leeds, which is a universe city. In other words, it is a city in which the university is the largest employer. In fact, in Leeds there are 3 universities. Leeds University itself is the largest non-collegiate university outside London. You then got what was the Polytechnic and one further degree. So it has a huge impact on the city itself. Students in the past were 18, 21. Nowadays we think about the idea of cradle-to-grave learning. In other words, what technology does, it increases the speed with which new knowledge is created and shared. And because it does that, this knowledge becomes out of date very, very quickly, in consequence of which you have to keep learning throughout your lifetime. It has been estimated that when a student goes up to get their degree certificate, that at least a quarter of their information will be out of date before they graduate. And finally, the idea of we all read books because we're academics. Not anymore. We get information from a vast array of different sources, not just books, but also online, etc., etc. And again, when I was a PhD student, I'm sure my tutor thought that I was a bit of a pain. Nowadays, you can't say that. Students now are potential colleagues. In fact, at Lincoln, we have the idea of the student as producer, the idea that students work with members of staff to actually produce knowledge. We've shifted from delivering a classroom like this. I could be giving this and it could be broadcast anywhere in the world, to the idea of delivering it anywhere. Most universities originally thought of themselves as local and national providers. Indeed, some universities were established deliberately to provide education for particular industries and particular centres. So, for example, in Manchester you had machinery, you had cotton, etc., etc. Now there seems to be global partners. They will often have partners across the globe. They will share students, they will share information. In terms of global partners, it may be worth me going digression one stage here, and that is there is an association of small nation states. The Isle of Man is not a member of it, but it could consider doing that, looking at global partners that have the same kind of problems. The idea of moving from a single discipline to multidisciplinary. In all our research, what we've got to try and show all the time is how our research impacts other disciplines elsewhere, to maximise our research impact. Because our research impact is measured every so many years in the research assessment exercise. And I speak of someone who had to do it for my institution. We're shifting from being an institution-centred to being market-centred, more particularly in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is the only country, not in Europe I should say, only country in the physicality of Europe that charges students fees of that size. Most other nation states give it for free or for a very small registration fee. In Finland, for example, you can go all the way up to getting a PhD without having to pay a single penny. So we've shifted from being government funded towards being market funded. Originally, technology was seen as an institutional expense. Oh God, we've got to spend the money on this. Nowadays, it's seen as a differentiator. Our university can provide very, very good teaching because it has an IT system or a learning environment which can do this thing. Many people have decided to use something like Blackboard, but not everyone. You can use Moodle, which is free. So, what I'm trying to show here is how the shift from low use of technology to high use of technology looks or has an effect elsewhere. So, if we're looking at what's happening in UKHE, I think most universities are about here. So in other words, they're using this new technology in the classroom as an audiovisual aid, but they're not going beyond that. Some are moving in this kind of direction, and I can point out places like what was Anglican Polytechnic who do some very good work. None of them is over here yet, apart from the UKLU. So there's a shift towards e-learning, away from no e-learning towards full e-learning. Having said that, within this particular idea, students are seen as being recipients of information, whereas within a revolutionary use of IT, they will become active learners who create knowledge for themselves, often working with other students. And this means the role the professor has to alter. I'll come to this later in more detail. So there's a shift from the professor as a provider of information to a facilitator of learning. And that requires a greater degree of equality between the student and the tutor, which is often very difficult to actually get. Here we see that it also requires a shift in the learning theory underpinning our teaching away from behaviourists towards the idea of experiential learning. The idea of knowledge is altered. In the past, knowledge was seen to be static, but because of ICT, not only in teaching and learning, but everywhere, knowledge is now dynamic. It's increasing ever faster because information moves seamlessly, ceaselessly from universities elsewhere. The use of ICTs has now become revolutionary. The pedagogical model has shifted. The teacher control is different. It is lower to some extent, although teachers now have to be much more aware of what learning involves. So it's not good enough any longer just to be an historian. You have to know how to teach history in a particular environment using particular tools. What this means is that the learner motivation needs to be not external, with the professor pushing them along, but internal. They need to internalise it and be able to learn as autonomous learners. This means that the mode of delivery ceases to be didactic and becomes much more dynamic. And in fact, in terms of assessment, we're no longer testing the memory of facts, we're testing competence for our system of learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are now, I think, used ubiquitously in every university in the UK. And in fact, if you're putting together a degree programme, you have to learn how to create them, which could take another hour to decide. So, in terms of assessment, we're moving away from a simple, unseen paper towards the idea of complex group projects. There are various reasons for this happening. So, for example, where there are students with certain particular disabilities, having an unseen paper produced particular burdens on them, and some of the reason for doing this was to reduce that burden so they could better demonstrate their expertise. Similarly, the student cohort, we still have a large number of full-time students, but at my universities and lots of others, postgraduate students are part-time. We're shifting away from a simple honours system towards much more of a modular matrix. Students can pick and mix different units. No longer it's a case of the staff providing the ability to teach about what they know. It's also about some recognition of student demand driven is what I need. The academic year has altered. At my university, if you're doing an MA, you can come in at different times of the year. Traditional qualifications like A-level have now been supplemented by the accreditation of prior certificated learning and prior experiential learning. And quality assurance, which used to be internal only, is now external. So we have people coming in and looking at what we're doing in terms of our teaching. So here we have the traditional, I'm sure you've seen people like this giving you lectures, When I was an undergraduate student, for example, we had to wear gowns to sit examinations. If you weren't wearing a gown, they'd push you out of the hall. Very strange.
Let's bring that back.
Well, so in the past, they were definitely at the stage who was not in any sense threatened on the stage. Listen to what I have to say. It is often said the information is to go from the mouth of the lecturer to pen the students, avoiding the brains of either. I think that's probably quite correct. So there's a shift now towards the idea of dynamic learning, what I want to know, away from maintenance learning, just in case. You need to know this information just in case. Now in the past, before I was actually a pupil in school, nevertheless people used to be taught the kings and queens of England. Why do you need to know that now? With a computer you can find that out in less than 10 seconds. Why do you need to store this information? You don't need to be able to store this information, but you do need to be able to know how to retrieve this information quickly and how to then re-engineer it into your own use. And again, we're shifting away from the idea of providing a huge great lump of information, to the idea of development of students. So they know certain knowledge that's requisite with respect to their own career progression and their ambitions. So there's a shift in the dependency, away from being dependent here, towards becoming an autonomous learner at the far end, and thereby becoming something more of a colleague with respect to students and tutors. This is more particularly the case when it comes to further degrees, PhDs. There's a shift away from a closed environment, with the idea of a study right, towards an open environment. So we now have flexible learning environments. They're flexible in terms of place, time, pace, form, and cost. When I used to deliver research methods, I teach research methods, I would have a virtual classroom actually in Ireland. A large number of students were Irish. And they would log in online, and they could see what I was doing. And they could also talk at the end of the discussion. So it was a very, very interesting discussion that we had, because these students brought some very interesting ideas from Ireland. So what I've tried to show here are the different shifts that occur and the way in which these have been focused then to create a virtual campus, which we'll come on to. So the idea of knowledge domain shifting, shifting learning and teaching, shifts in technology, and shifts also in organisations. And this is really what universities are about. So they're very hierarchical structures, they were. They're now becoming much more international networks. That's more particularly the case, I think, in some specific countries in Europe. And the reason I mention Finland is because I'm also a docent professor there. But the Finns are very, very good at using new technology in teaching and learning. Really good at it, among the best. Another place that's very good at it is the Open University of Catalonia. They're really very good. If you ever look at their website, it's all in English, Catalan, and Spanish. Very, very good people. So, what would the student look like within a virtual campus? Here we have various elements of the learning process to produce an intensely supported learning environment with the student right at the centre of it. And I'll show you exactly what is meant by that. So here we have new learning environment on campus. We have live lectures. We have face-to-face seminars. But we also have learning resources, the intranet, and also lectures via the World Wide Web, videotape and CD-ROM. So again, we have an intensely supported learning environment. And because there is now great use of new technology in conventional universities, the difference between on and off campus has now become muted and reduced. So if we're looking off campus, again we have the learner in the centre here. We might have a lecture via the web, as we've seen before, use of the internet, learning resource centre, seminars via computer video conferencing like Teams, and again we have the student in the middle of it, an intensely supported learning environment. And what this does, it alters the role of the tutor, more particularly when we're off campus. And as you can see here, there are various stages that the role of the tutor undertakes in terms of the building of knowledge. So they start off by using e-moderating, welcoming. They then provide bridges between different learning environments and socialisation. They start to facilitate tasks using different learning materials for information exchange. They facilitate this process of knowledge instruction, and then final in-person learning. And this shows the different steps in the way in which they work. So what is done here is that different activities, e-activities as they're known, are developed to enable students to move through these various stages in order to develop their own knowledge and the ability to use that knowledge dynamically. And here are some ideas about utilities. The idea of utilities was put together by, again, a lecturer at UKNU called Julie Salmon. And it's used not just in the UK but elsewhere. So the idea is that it's based on interaction between individual learners and students via active collaboration with the use of technology. There's an e-moderator. They're usually asynchronous, in other words, they're not bound by time. They can be driven by simple text, but quite usually they're more sophisticated, more particularly if the technology becomes sophisticated. They can be used either on campus or off campus. They can be used just as one element of a module, or they can be built around an entire program. In fact, the first online MBA the OU produced involved utilities, and Julie Salmon worked in the business faculty when she did that. So, we know that new technologies are now in universities, and the use of these technologies are driving traditional and distance education together. And for universities to be able to use these new technologies, we need to make changes in the university's traditional operations, unfortunately. And these include the following. Firstly, we're shifting from a teacher-centred, didactical, passive instruction mode to a learner-centred interactive exchange. Students take a much greater responsibility for their learning needs. We're shifting away from traditional chalk and talk towards multimedia. I don't know any lecturer who still does some chalk and talk. Having said that, they haven't shifted very far. Nowadays it's chalk, talk and PowerPoint. Basically. In fact, interestingly enough, I gave a presentation in the United States at New York University, and well, I was about to set it up, and someone came over and said, "Where's the PowerPoint?" I said, "I don't know how PowerPoint." What? It was a really big problem. So, instead of moving away from one route, chalk and talk, we now provide information through multiple media, different resources, worldwide, in fact. And we've shifted away from having something that's externally timetabled to looking at what individuals actually want to do. And one aspect of this is, in the past we used to think about classroom tasks as being undertaken by individual students. Nowadays, however, even within traditional universities, there's much more collaborative learning and group learning. Not least because when students get their degrees and go out into industry, they won't be learning by themselves or working by themselves. They'll be working as part of a team. So it's very important for them to develop these soft skills of working with other people collaboratively. There's a shift away from memory of facts towards assessing achievements rather than memory, through looking at students' long-term learning outcomes in lives and asking them to personally reflect. And that's a very important part of this. The idea that you should be, to quote the phrase, a reflective practitioner. You should be able to see what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and thereby move forward. And finally, moving away from particular face-to-face tutoring with a uniform group towards having an asynchronous group which combines students from a variety of different places. This last page, looking at utilisation of print-based materials towards having information being mined through different sources using the web. A much broader support network. We have learning advisors, learning support, and we call some of these people knowledge navigators because they know their way around the web to create knowledge. And this is very important. The idea of students no longer having a subordinate role, but becoming much more equal and also engaged in the research process. That's more particularly the case when it comes to Masters and PhD work. Before we move on to the next bit, just to go back a bit, one of the big problems there is with trying to engage some of these shifts is resistance by staff. It's very difficult to ask someone who's spent 30 years honing their skills as a lecturer, using chalk and talk to say, right, we now want you to use new technologies for teaching and learning. Very, very difficult indeed. And the problem is that students themselves use these technologies ubiquitously. They've all got mobile phones, some of them have more than 2 mobile phones. They were asked, I remember one student saying, why is it I can't phone up or get my module result over the web when I know I can pay my gas bill at any time of the day or night over the phone? A very good point. So let's now look on trends that have occurred globally. So the World Bank, a very good group, the World Bank, decided they would look at exactly what's going to happen with respect to higher education. So knowledge is now emerging as a major driver of economic development. So there was lots of discussion about the information society and the knowledge economy. And the idea was that, in fact this was something that Tony Blair was speaking, we would try and create a knowledge economy. There aren't many countries that come close to that. I would suspect, again, Finland is pretty close. Largely because they don't really have that many natural resources apart from trees for paper, much more than well. But they do have a very, very well-educated workforce in ways you wouldn't imagine. So, for example, if you're a PhD student in Finland, you do not write your thesis, your PhD in Finnish, unless you're in Finnish literature, because only a very small number of people will read it. If you're doing a PhD in engineering, you write it in English, because then more people will read it. You've only got 5 million Finns. The number of engineers in Finland is finite. That's what they're now doing. So the ICT revolution has transformed delivery notes, but also organisational patterns in tertiary education. We now, unfortunately, have got market forces in HE and a global market. There's now a large number, which I'll come on to, of private universities, for example. There has been requests increasingly for financial support for reform of higher education made to the World Bank with respect to these particular trends. They think there's a recognition, however, for a much more balanced view of education as an holistic system. The guys from the World Bank Institute were very, very good, very, very able people, really good. But they were always going on about HE being, to some extent, I'll come back to this, to some extent, increasing barriers between different groups of people. Having access to IT is now becoming more and more important. In fact, believe it or not, the Finns are thinking of adding a new part to their constitution and making it a universal right to get access to the web. It will be written to the constitution, believe it or not. So, I have here 3 quotations from gurus in the field. Firstly, we have Howard Bookbinder. The combination of underfunded universities, high-tech developments, corporate needs, and the prevailing ideology have led to a basic transformation to a university oriented to the marketplace. That's more particularly the case in the United States, but also in many of the Latin American states as well, because they tend to follow the US. And within Europe, clearly the UK, but not other countries in Europe. Higher education is now in a global competitive marketplace. Individuals are able to choose what they wish to acquire, knowledge they wish to acquire, rather than accepting the dictates of institutions. I don't know how true that is. It will probably become increasingly true. And finally, what would the post-secondary marketplace look like, say Microsoft, Deutsche Telekom, International Thompson, and the University of California combined to use UC courses? I mean, the same might, if you could consider the same, should we say, in Australia. If Rupert Murdoch decided to work with an Australian university to have a degree in journalism, the Murdoch organisation is so huge, you could see that a large number of people will want to take that particular course, even though it might involve quite a large fee. Unfortunately, as a result of the large increase in the use of ICT, we now have 2 major challenges for HE. The first is to try and integrate ICT into educational systems and institutions, and this has positive and negative effects elsewhere. Secondly, to ensure ICTs are agents of equity and can expand access and increase educational opportunities for everyone. And that is a real problem. And I've got some statistics down here to give you some ideas. So, there are 8 PCs per 100 people of population in South Africa, 14 in Chile, 62 in Singapore, 86 in Switzerland. In terms of internet users, about 40% of the population are internet users in Africa. The equivalent in Europe is twice that. So already there's a technological divide between students in different nation states about the extent to which they can access new technologies. And to give you some idea how this works, I had a student from Nigeria, PhD student, who had to go back. He went back. It was very, very difficult to continue supporting him. The only way I could have a seminar with him online was if he used his mobile phone, because he did not have access locally to the internet or a machine. It made life incredibly difficult, really difficult. So there is a real problem that ICT has revolutionised higher education in the wealthy nation states, but it has also increased the divide between the educational provision in these nation states with the educational provision in the poorer states themselves. And it's difficult to see how that can be rectified. So, ICT in HE has effective demand. Knowledge-based economies require increasing levels of educational training, which means there's going to be an increase in demand for higher education. So in the past we used to look and see how many undergraduate students we had coming in. We now know in the UK that about 50% of people in 18 to 21-year-old cohort who can become undergraduates. We're now much more concerned about master's students, because having a master's degree enables differentiation and a cutting edge when compared with students with a first degree who are also applying for the same job. Students demand courses to aid their career progression and equip them to be lifelong learners. In other words, students are now looking, more particularly at postgraduate level, at courses which may be linked directly to progression in a particular field, rather than looking at something generic. One of the courses we had in Lincoln, for example, was very popular, was an Ed.D, doctorate of education, and we found that large numbers of teachers took that particular degree. Although they had got a first degree in history and become history teachers, as they progressed through the educational system, they gained particular insight and knowledge with respect to secondary education, and that then formed the basis for their doctorates.
Do you still run that?
Sorry?
Sorry, do you still run that?
It's now changed to become various reasons, a PhD. It's not a traditional PhD, although we still do have traditional PhD. It's called PhD Professional. And if you think about the conventional PhD, it was very definitely geared to people who were going to make research their profession. Whereas with respect to those doing the Ed.D, they are to some extent educational professionals. It's quite a different degree. Although it has the same roots, it also has a very large thesis element. Coming before I go any further yet, what it does in the first instance is give people a background in educational research. They're then able to undertake a doctoral dissertation relating to their particular area of expertise.
Yeah, no, my other half did her doctorate as an Ed.D. She did it in Liverpool, but she was one of the last ones to do it before they stopped doing it. So I was curious this sort of move towards ending the Ed.D.
Well, the reason it moved towards a PhD prof was because it was less constraining when it came to trying to improve your career or even shift careers to another sector. It wasn't seen to be tied directly to education. That's why it was done. Although, again, we looked at the supportive courses as well, so they all have to do research methods. And finally, there's a change in demand, a greater personalisation of provision in terms of flexible courses. This is more particularly with respect to where you're delivering courses on micro-credentials and things like that. There's also been an impact on supply. So, because there's now a market in higher education, didn't used to be, various people in the corporate sector thought, hey, wait a minute, we could actually teach this, we can make some money on this. And they started to do that. So there's now a new type of corporate university, which is exploiting this market for career training, more particularly in these type of professionals. As you can see, I put the Ed.D just there. So, in terms of delivery, more institutions not just traditional universities, but others as well, are using new technologies for on-campus students and to provide courses at a distance. And there have been some universities also that have set up campuses in other nation states. Some of these have not worked particularly well. We'll draw a line over that. So, these are the type of new providers we have. We get corporate partnerships. Anglia Polytechnic University had a very interesting development where they put together a bespoke course for Ford in terms of MBAs for staff across Europe within Ford's operations. That was very, very high profile in the university. It worked okay, not fantastic. I think Ford had very different expectations. There are some very innovative distance and virtual universities. Open University of Catalonia. I've seen a virtual classroom at University of Catalonia. So you saw this classroom, you saw desks. As the students logged in, their faces appeared at the desks, and they could see it as well. I mean, these people are just incredibly good at using new technology. Really good. Even to teach philosophy, they're just absolutely ace at it. The Further University is the Open University of Germany. Again, they're also very, very good, more particularly with respect to scientific and technical. Finland, I helped them create the Finnish Virtual University, which was too successful. I should explain that. So, the Finnish Virtual University enables students to take different units online. And in Finland, you normally would attend university near to where you live. The problem is that Helsinki is huge, and Helsinki has an international reputation, whereas the University of Vasa doesn't. So students at Vasa are saying, no, wait a minute, I can take some of these units at Helsinki. That'll help me. So Helsinki numbers start to go up, and Vasa starts to get worried. Wait a minute, what's happening here? So they stopped it. Private universities, the International University in Germany has campuses elsewhere. It uses ICT and it's sponsored by a variety of different corporate companies. Interestingly enough, Lincoln had a link with Siemens, the Faculty of Engineering at Siemens. Out-of-country providers, anyone heard of the University of Phoenix? Diploma mill? No? Yeah, okay, so they were successful in the US, more particularly in Houston, France. They're now trying to set up bases elsewhere in Europe, trying to cut other people. So, we now move down to what lessons we can learn from the university. Firstly, there's clearly been massification, huge growth in student numbers, because people need skills, because the global knowledge economy is expanding. Having said that, at the same time as student numbers are going up, government funding per student has gone down. And what they're trying to get us to do is provide more scholars but fewer dollars. And it's proving to be very, very difficult. And the suggestion has been made that they can use these new technologies to try and cut costs. That's not really true. The problem with e-learning, as I said, it's very difficult because e-learning is different things to different people. E-learning done well is not cheap. It can, however, be cheap in the very long term. So as I said, the OU may take 4 years to put together a course, but if that course then runs for 10 years plus, it'll be very cost effective. Lifelong learning. What has happened is that in order to remain in labour and work, students in the knowledge economy have to repeatedly upgrade their knowledge itself. So students don't just come for a single degree now, they think about the whole of their working lives. So quite often students will get a first degree somewhere else, then they'll go back to their hometown and work there. They may then need to do an MA, they will do the MA part-time at a local university. And in order to do that, they need to be able to be autonomous learners. They need to be able to work by themselves and have the skill to do that. It means, however, students do not have to attend the university for tuition, but can study anywhere and any time. Having said that, we all know that new technologies like AI can also render knowledge redundant and lead to job losses. And that's a big fear that the UCU, among others, has identified. New ICTs. ICTs are becoming more and more technical. AI has driven this, and what this means is that information, subject, content can be sent anywhere at no cost. We've had commercial, global learning enterprises competing with universities. AI is going to revolutionise, as we'll come to, teaching and research, and this could undermine the role of the traditional lecturing firm. I don't know if any of you used AI, ChatGPT, to look at what it will do in terms of essays. Students won't get an A for the essays it produces, but they might get a reasonable B though. What this has meant is that there has been a shift and a push towards greater professionalism with respect to university teaching. I remember when I was a student, I once came in for a lecture, it was in microeconomics, and the lecturer started to give last week's lecture. No one told him. Halfway through he realised, and he then gave this week's lecture in half an hour. That doesn't happen any longer. So there's been a shift in terms of expertise being required of lecturers, not just to be subject experts, but to use the technology to teach. And in fact, there's now been a big shift towards accreditation of teaching in higher education through HEA. Is anyone here HEA accredited?
Yeah.
Yeah? We now have the ability to provide much more flexible modular courses, and where students demand them, we now have to think about this. There's much greater use now of accreditation of prior certificate in experiential learning. So although students must have something like a global reach in order to survive, they also need to provide courses geared to the needs of individual students. And that can be quite difficult. Collaboration. I think this particular idea is very important for an institution like the University College here in Alabama. Because we now have global trends in higher education, we need to think about academic collaboration between universities at not just European levels, but also at international levels. Unfortunately, because Britain came out of the EU, we had to stop taking Erasmus students. Erasmus was the most successful EU programme or policy after the introduction of the euro. Huge numbers of students went to other nation states to study, many of them staying there. And many of them came to the UK because they wished to improve their English. We can't do that anymore. The government has put together another package which will supposedly aid Erasmus. It's called Turing, which not many people have applied for because it's Anglophone. Why would you go to do a course in Australia when previously you could have gone to do a course in Spain? So, collaboration is often very important. And what we're also finding is that, and I found this in Latin America, national open universities in Europe are now collaborating with universities in developing nation states, not only to extend their geographical reach, but also increase their student numbers. So UNED, which is Universidad Nacional Educación a la Distance, Spanish, OU, has set up learning centres in 6 Latin American nation states. And UNED is now the largest, in terms of student numbers, the largest open university in the world. They overtook the UKOU many years ago. Strategic thinking. Here I have 3 quotes looking at what's exactly going to happen. So, Ken Edwards, the use of information technologies questions the basic functions of the university. Coldrick, many academics will have to confront the reality that the task of the academic teacher is shifting from the transmission of knowledge towards management and facilitation of learning. Again, this big shift between passive teaching to dynamic learning. And a note from Pierre Tabatoni, the history of universities is littered with situations of crisis, deterioration and takeover, brought about by an inability to respond to fresh requirements. I've got 10 minutes.
We've got 8 actually now, as you can see.
Right, okay. I'll ignore this then. And I've got to this. So, before COVID-19, the OU and other national open universities use new technology for teaching and learning. Other universities didn't. Having said that, because of COVID, we now had to shift towards the use of new technologies. We use them, some use them in blended learning, but we were then forced to shift, and great use was made of systems like Blackboard. But at this stage, these digital technologies were used to provide synchronous interactive learning, but this didn't really affect mainstream teaching. COVID, however, forced us all to use EdTech for the delivery of content and also the process of knowledge creation. Very, very difficult. Research has shown that in ICTs, the use of ICTs during COVID were used to bolster teaching technologies rather than alter the way in which we teach itself. Another large-scale study of 300 students found that students taking the course during the pandemic performed nearly as well as normal. However, another piece of research indicated the reason why people did not learn as well possibly online was the fact that they were completely stressed out in COVID anyway. So it's a high level of anxiety. So it may be very difficult to compare face-to-face teaching with use of ICT. AI. I have a definition here of AI. Work that's been done by Compton and Stone said, AI has the vast potential to support teaching and learning in the higher education system, such as bespoke learning, intelligence tutoring, facilitating collaboration. ChatGPT was introduced in November 2020. It's now reached 100 million users. It did that in 2 months. There's very little research done on it so far because it's so new. Having said that, content analysis of news articles about ChatGPT found that it's disrupting what's happening in Niche, but providing opportunities for greater assessment in terms of innovation and a concern, however, for academic integrity. UNESCO has gone to the trouble of putting together artificial intelligence information to try and address the main challenges and ethical implications of AI and HE. Do any of you here use Turnitin? Yeah, okay. Turnitin was useful increase, I think, as well. We'll have to keep checking it. EDUCAUSE produced a very good report this year about AI. AI sparked debates about academic integrity, accuracy and fairness. AI-powered writing technologies are becoming more sophisticated, leading many to think that cheating will become widespread. Further work done by Liv Berber found that ChatGPT is viewed positively by staff as a useful tool, but that there are ethical concerns about plagiarism and misinformation. Whether these benefits are realised or these concerns justified remains to be seen. And thank you for at least sitting here and listening to what was a gallop I appreciate, but I did start with it. Any comments, queries?
Thank you.
So,
Yeah. So thank you very much. That's very, very interesting.
well, I will give the presentation to go so anyone else can read it at their leisure.
Wonderful. I was interested with the creation of courses that are tailored to the individual, though. There seems to be a tendency in universities, I found more recently, to focus on a professional accreditation, something that produces a piece of paper at the end of a course.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that tendency and the associated decline in the ability to take an individual, tailored, modular-based approach? For example, night courses, distance learning CPD modules only. 15 years ago you could buy a module. Very hard to buy a module from the university now. You have to buy the master's or the degree. So how do you reconcile those tendencies with this move towards tailored courses, and have we reached a high point?
I don't know. What tends to happen is that universities put together degrees which enable flexibility. So, for example, at Lincoln we had an MA by learning contract. So the students could put together a learning contract which specified what they were going to do for their research. In fact, the production of the learning contract was a module within the award. So it pretty much meant they could do an MA on anything.
So they could do the whole MA on anything.
Yeah.
They couldn't acquire a master's module, for example, in a particular thing.
No, because the effort involved in putting together the teaching module that was bespoke in that sense will be huge. Most of the work with respect to bespoke education has come, as I indicated, with collaborations between companies and universities themselves.
But then, as I said, 10, 15 years ago, I could buy a module from a university online, and now I can't. So has there been this move away from that?
I think that's because the use of new technologies has become greater and much more ubiquitous than it used to be. But I accept what you're saying. There is I suppose, a tension between wanting to differentiate and also wanting to gather as much students as you can, and that suggests there should be the lowest common denominator in terms of course delivery. Because it's much cheaper. It's much cheaper to teach 300 students in a lecture than it is to teach 10 at a time. So there is this dynamic tension between the desire for, in essence, courses that benefit their own career progression and the university pushing for, as I said, more scholars but fewer dollars, which will continue, I'm sure.
I think many years ago as well that some of the module courses that you had were very strict and set out, and this was it, this was your course. You started here, you did each year as a module, and then you got the qualification at the end. And then you went into a career with that in mind. Now I think careers are so diverse in what you do in each profession that the courses have to match, and all the degrees you do have to match each section individually. Hence the fact that you can't just collect one module that one size fits all anymore. And I think it has to be all these individual courses to match each part of the profession, I think, rather than a complete. I did an accountancy one many years ago, whereas everything was set out for me. From the Open University, and it was each module was completely set out. I followed these strict learning guidelines and the qualification at the end, and that was it. I'm now in a completely new profession, and my coursework is coming through with regards to my teacher. We're discussing what we need to learn, and then we develop the courses from that particular sort of need from our profession. I'm now a canine nutritionist, and we're learning. It's a brand spanking new profession. There's only one course out there at the moment that's Ofsted regulated, and we're developing it as we go along. I'm a student, but encouraging my teachers to create courses that I need.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a couple of issues there. One is that there's a shift towards greater professionalisation. So, for example, in nursing, in the past, you did not need to have a degree in nursing. They're now pressing to put degrees in nursing, and therefore we have to put modules together in order to try and professionalise that.
Yes.
And again, it takes time and effort to do it.
I am going to have to draw this to a close, but as I said every other time, no one's going away. Talk to Terence there. But there is I think that conundrum you point to is probably the old institution way of it's better to get £9,000 in for 6 modules a year, than it is to let people pick and choose, which creates an uncertainty in income on the shorter scale. And as someone has spent most of their summer investigating academic conduct with the use of AI, I think that those final slides are
It's a big worry. Very little research has been done, but lots of people say it could be very, very good, but you never know. And I have a large number of students who come from overseas who have a very different opinion about what constitutes plagiarism.
Yeah.
So our assessments now, they're being changed more towards reflexive model now because of the ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think that's the point you raised about a greater degree of reflection on what one's doing, critical reflection, which didn't exist before.
No. So I'm left with this, and probably we'll talk to you more about this, Terence, with my big question that came out of your presentation was the readiness of our students to behave as some of your trends indicated, to be that self-directed, autonomous learner. I think from my experience often the students don't seem prepared for that when they come to us at degree level. So there's something interesting for me there.
Especially if they're coming from a school where it's
Yeah.
spoon-fed.
Still need the information
Yeah.
delivered. But listen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really interesting. Articulated and brought together a lot of themes and ideas there. Thank you.